Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. My name is Christina Sweet, and I'm with the Vermont Community Broadband Board staff. I'm joined by my colleague, Alexi Montserrat, today, and we're here for a Vermont Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Pre-Award webinar. We're going to be providing an overview of the award and application process for the Vermont BEAD program, also known as VT-BEAD. And in just a minute, I'm going to pass this off to our colleagues at RSM who have been working with us over the past couple of months to prepare for this opportunity, and they will lead you over the information over the next half an hour or so. And after that, we will have time for Q&A. So thanks very much, and I'll pass it off to RSM.
Thanks, Christina. Hi, everyone. My name is Jill Reyes. I'm a partner here at RSM, and it's great to meet with you this morning. You can see that we have a pretty full agenda. However, as Christina mentioned, it's an overview of the BEAD requirements, and so today will be fairly high level. We welcome your questions, and we will add them to the frequently asked questions document that's in progress. And then there will be some additional trainings later on that I think we'll talk about later today. But for those of you who aren't familiar with RSM, there's a little bit about the firm on the screen, but I'm joined today by Jen Wade, who is a director in our practice. She is a former state agency leader over broadband grant programs, and I'll let her tell you a little bit about herself shortly. But we are currently assisting the Vermont Community Broadband Board by supporting the VT-BEAD process, as well as all of you through the application and technical assistance needs that you may have over the course of the program. Happy to take those questions at any time. There are several ways that you can reach not only us, but the VCBB at your convenience, and we look forward to hearing your questions. Next slide, please. And so I will pass it over to Jen Wade so she can tell you a little bit about herself, and then we'll get into the overview of the program and into the rest of the content.
Thanks, Jill. So yes, as Jill mentioned, Jen Wade, director in our practice here at RSM. I am a former state broadband leader, advisor, etc. In my time here at RSM, I've been really a technical advisor on our BEAD and broadband program. So really happy to join you all today, getting to dive into the overview of the program just for time's sake here. And as they have both alluded to, high-level overview. So when we get to certain things, we could, spend hours kind of going through this, but we're going to high-level many of these requirements of the BEAD program. In June of 2023, Vermont was allocated $228.9 million of federal BEAD funds. Funds are prioritized for unserved locations, those that can't get access of 25 over 3 megabits per second, and underserved locations, or those that can't get between over 25 over 3 and 100 over 20 megabits per second. For planning phase, VCBB has submitted 3 BEAD plans to the federal government to NTIA, the 5-year action plan, initial proposal, volume 1 and volume 2. For those of you who may have prior awards under state fiscal recovery funds, CPF, Reconnect, RDOF, etc., those requirements are going to vary from the BEAD program. Some may overlap and there may be similar requirements with just different facets to them. But in general, the BEAD requirements are much more prescriptive than prior programs that you may be used to, including the eligible expenses that are awarded or afforded to the states to utilize for the BEAD program. Among the eligible expenses, and we'll talk through those in just a moment, there are a list of limited permissible activities that are outlined specifically in the BEAD terms and conditions and the NOFO. In addition to that, the letter of credit performance bonds is a requirement that you may not be used to. There are matching fund requirements under the BEAD program. NEPA and NHPA are requirements under the BEAD program that were not applicable under state fiscal recovery funds and capital project funds. as well as Build America, Buy American. So if you may recall, on certain programs prior to the BEAD program, this was a preference really and not a mandate. And so it is a requirement with some waivers that we'll talk through as well. Davis-Bacon, there's a different threshold for Davis-Bacon in BEAD, so I wanted to highlight that as well. There is a cybersecurity and supply chain risk management requirement under BEAD as well. The payment structure, the utilization of fixed awards, while CPF and state fiscal recovery funds did evolve to that in May of 2023 with the uniform guidance updates provided by Treasury. NTIA has harmonized, are in harmony with that. And so we'll talk through the payment structure under VC-BEAD's structure there, and as well as the monitoring and compliance that is very much outlined in the BEAD NOFO. So we'll talk through that as well. Again, I mentioned the eligible expenses here, the eligible uses of funding in connection with the BEAD program. And again, I'm not going to read through all these, but they are highlighted explicitly in the guidance for BEAD, including construction and improvements or acquisition to facilities and telecommunications equipment required to implement the program, long-term leases, deployment, engineering and permitting design, network software, training for the cybersecurity piece of that, and workforce development. Here, again, there are implementation activities, right, that are aligning to the site preparation, demolition, construction, ground disturbance, fixed insulation, or any other implementation activities may not begin prior to the completion of the EHP, the environmental requirements, NEPA and NHPA, outlined in the section of the BEAD NOFO. And we'll get to that a little bit when we talk through NEPA and NHP requirements. However, it is really important to understand what these limited permissible activities are and what are allowed prior to the completion of the NEPA and NHPA requirements. So based on the guidance that is outlined by NTIA, VC-BEAD will allow the limited permissible activities under NEPA to proceed with using the funds prior to the completion of EHP review. So again, wanted to highlight these: pre-construction and planning, applications for environmental permits, studies, including but not limited to your EAs or your environmental assessments, wetland delineations, biological assessments, archaeological surveys, and other environmental reviews and analysis. Administrative costs, a big question that kind of really everyone's asking on the BEAD program, the pre-award application costs are under the limited permissible activities. Activities supporting consultation required under the NHPA, Endangered Species Act, and the Clean Water Act. And then limited preliminary procurement, including the purchase of lease of equipment or entering into binding contracts to do so. I do want to highlight here, and this is really important, that subrecipients or potential subrecipients, if you're a potential applicant for the BEAD program for VC-BEAD, that undertake unauthorized project activities in contravention of the information proceed at their own risk and may face deobligation of funding, and subrecipients that incur costs prior to the execution of the final award agreement proceed at their own risk and may face rejection of those costs if deemed unallowable. So these are extremely crucial as you're building your budgets to apply for the BEAD program, but just understanding what is allowed prior to the NHPA and NEPA requirements. I did mention, so the letter of credit and performance bonds is a requirement that we haven't seen in previous programs. And just to highlight here, during the application period, VC-BEAD asked that the applicants be able to certify that their organization is aware of the requirement, that it understands a letter of credit or performance bond obligation as outlined in the NOFO, and then are required to advise if you'll be using a letter of credit or a performance bond through the application process. VC-BEAD will make preliminary awards, which are subject to final review and approval by NTIA. But prior to entering into the agreement, prospective subrecipients must complete the following. Each prospective subrecipient must establish either its own financial qualifications to participate in the VT-BEAD program, with a letter of credit, which you'll see as the acronym LOC, or the alternative, obtaining a performance bond, ensuring its performance of the subaward. Secondarily, the VC-BEAD will require that prospective subrecipients using the LOC to obtain one that is equal to 25% of the subaward amount to begin receiving funding. If the subrecipient meets the build-out plan that's set forth in the proposal in the first year, it will be allowed to renew the LOC in the amount that's consistent with the section 2.3 of the programmatic waiver. So all the requirements for letter of credit and performance bond outline within the application phase align to the NTIA's programmatic waiver sections. I mentioned the matching funds requirement as well. So what are matching funds? They're also known as a cost share. It's really the portion of the project's cost that is not paid by federal funds. The BEAD program has a requirement for a 25% match for deployment projects, and this is exclusive of the high-cost areas. Any funds provided as match for deployment must stay with the project and cannot be allocated to other program activities. So talking through what can count as match, there are certain requirements set out in the statute as what can be deemed match, and we'll talk through that. But as far as who can provide the match, it can be directly from the subrecipient, the ISP, etc. It can come from a nonprofit organization or a partner, a local government, unit of local government, a utility company, the eligible entity, should be the state, a federal regional commission or authority, or a for-profit company, regional planning, government organization cooperative. So this is the eligible source of funding. So funds from other federal programs, including funds from the FCC's Universal Service Funds program, generally may not be used as match. However, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act does expressly provide that matching funds for the BEAD program can come from, those entities that I did outline earlier. It can also come from the Families First Coronavirus Response Act of 2020, the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Secure Act of 2020, or what we refer to as the CARES Fund, the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021, or the American Rescue Plan Act of 2021. And it can also come from loan funding, through things such as the USDA's Reconnect program, and those can all be used as match funds. Here's a brief slide on the criteria for match. Again, I won't read through every single one of these, but really just ensuring that it conforms to the requirements outlined in the NOFO to make sure that it meets the requirements. And one of the biggest questions that we are getting from potential applicants are the use of in-kind match. So NTIA has outlined that in-kind match may be utilized during the program. And so I wanted to talk briefly about what that entails and what your expectations are in putting that in your proposal. So in-kind match is really the non-cash donation, and it can be anything from property, goods, services, it can be personnel and things like that, but that benefit your project. It may count towards satisfying that non-federal matching requirement that is outlined in the BEAD NOFO for your total budgeted cost when such contributions meet the criteria. So they must be allowable and allocable project expenses and may come from a third party as you're putting these together. I do want to highlight that VC-BEAD is required to maintain the documentation to justify the use of the in-kind match, such as property and services, that a potential applicant may contribute to its BEAD total project costs. So if you're thinking of using in-kind match when you're putting your budgets together and applying for BEAD funding, it is really important to provide the support behind the in-kind match. The documentation really behind this should show how the assigned value was determined for the match, whether it's personnel, services, or goods. And you should maintain records that detail the contribution, the date that it was contributed, the valuation method, and donation terms really to support the amount that you're claiming for the match funds for the project. The contribution should also be relevant to the project. and then have evaluation methodology, again, just to support that it actually reflects allowability and then actual market conditions. So here are just, again, a few examples of what in-kind match could be and the applicability of this. We talked about personnel, so employee or volunteer services, equipment, supplies, indirect costs can also be used as in-kind match. Again, on the supply kind of and equipment front, computer hardware and software, the use of facilities, facilities in general, waiver of fees associated with access to right-of-way, pole attachments, conduits, and such can also be used as in-kind match. Okay. Moving to the NEPA and NHPA summary overview really of what this requirement is. Again, I mentioned that this was not a requirement during some of the previous programs. Really, so the National Environmental Policy Act states that the states must ensure that BEAD-funded projects do comply with the NEPA regulations, which require environmental assessments or impact statements for activities affecting the environment. This includes evaluating potential impacts of broadband infrastructure on natural resources, wildlife, habitats, and water systems, while NHPA, or the National Historic Preservation Act, requires that the BEAD projects comply with the NHP requirements. That requires the states to assess the impact of the broadband infrastructure on things like historic sites, cultural landmarks, and tribal lands. Coordination with state historic preservation offices, or SHPOs, and tribal historic preservation offices is also crucial to avoid delays on these projects. So again, as this is an overview, we could talk at length regarding some of the NEPA and NHPA requirements, but some of the key takeaways from the overview is really understanding that there is a NEPA compliance requirement. So projects that are funded with BEAD have to comply with those requirements, requiring those environmental reviews and approvals before any construction can begin. And again, going back to the eligible expenses and limited permissible activities, those have to align. And applicants, or potential applicants rather, even must align their project timelines with the NEPA review process and approval process. And in preparing for the environmental reviews, applicants or potential applicants should anticipate the need to provide detailed environmental impact assessments and supporting documentation, or their understanding of that as they go through the process. And really understanding the NEPA process, starting that early on can help streamline approvals and avoid any project delays. And really one of the biggest takeaways is avoiding the starting construction prematurely, right? I did, again, under the limited permissible activities, construction on projects can't begin until all of the NEPA requirements are fulfilled. So premature construction may result in noncompliance or jeopardizing of the funding. So that is crucial. BEAD subrecipients or subgrantees must provide a milestone schedule identifying specific deadlines and describing how subgrantee proposes to meet timing requirements for the completion of any required consultations, the completion of applicable reviews for NEPA and the NHPA Section 106 and Endangered Species Act. The submission of EAs, or environmental assessments, or the EIS, environmental impact statements as well, if required. These milestone schedules, they will include NEPA and permitting work that qualifies as those limited permissible pre-implementation activities. And so this is really moving from what we're looking forward to now, which would be the application phase and the award phase. So this is what the subrecipients will be required to submit over to the state and then ultimately to NTIA. Here's just a visual really of the items required prior to project start: NEPA review, NHPA review again, and applicable additional reviews. And there are links here that we can provide you, and they are also outlined in the FAQs as well. But again, to highlight, very, very important key takeaway: subrecipients or even potential applicants, as you are seeking to apply for BEAD funds may not begin any grant-funded project implementation activities until these key items are submitted and approved. And again, as I mentioned, the Build America, Buy America BABA requirement, again, was a preference in some previous programs. It is a requirement here. It incentivizes the domestic production of specific manufactured projects. This is based on strategic prioritization criteria that includes network and data security, which will directly expand American job opportunities. The key requirements for BABA under BEAD are domestic sourcing of material, really for iron and steel, manufactured products. The majority of components must be, 55% of the total cost in manufactured good must be sourced domestically. This includes fiber optics, cables, electronics, and network equipment as well. Construction materials such as glass, lumber, drywall, plastic, etc., used in the construction must also be manufactured in the U.S. These requirements apply to any infrastructure project funded under the BEAD program, including deployment of broadband networks and related facilities. And as I mentioned briefly earlier, there are general public interest waivers. There are several waivers under the program. This is issued when adherence to BABA would be inconsistent with public interest. There are non-availability waivers, unreasonable cost waivers. But I will say the waiver request must be well documented and approved by the relevant federal or state agency overseeing the program. And there is rigid compliance and enforcement on the Build America, Buy America requirement. Broadband providers and contractors must maintain and track and have robust tracking for this to support any of their purchases to ensure that it complies with the BABA requirement. And if not, that could be a non-compliance finding. So really the impact of this, there is really an increased project planning and coordination to source compliant materials for this. And again, even with the waivers, there's potential cost and time implications due to supply chain. And opportunities for collaboration with domestic manufacturers and suppliers to streamline the compliance of this. There are additional details that are outlined on the BABA requirements and NTIA guidance that really we've linked here. We'll provide again in subsequent training sessions and in the FAQs. But you can see items on the waivers, what that entails by going to those links. But again, just remembering prospective entities are going to be held responsible to self-certify and report compliance with the BABA requirements and the use of the BABA waiver for the BEAD program. Just some best practices also for meeting the BABA requirements, early supplier engagement. If you haven't already, starting that earlier supplier engagement, identifying domestic suppliers for broadband equipment and materials, starting the documentation phase if you are already, thinking about applying for BEAD and what that looks like with a robust tracking and documentation system. And then education and training, really training project teams and contractors on BABA requirements to make sure they understand and can adhere to the requirement. Again, just some more information on the BABA waiver. They may waive the application of this preference or of this requirement mandate rather when the public interest and consistencies are there, insufficiently produced materials, and increased U.S. materials cost, as I outlined earlier. Again, I mentioned the Davis-Bacon requirement. Contractors must pay laborers and mechanics working on site at least the locally prevailing wages. This includes fringe and benefits listed in the Davis-Bacon wage determination applicable to the contract for the work performed. Davis-Bacon labor standards clauses must be included in cover contracts, and that's one thing from a compliance and monitoring standpoint. Those contracts will be looked at to make sure that those clauses are included in any contracts related to the broadband work under BEAD. There are two ways that you can meet the Davis-Bacon requirement, there is a Davis-Bacon certification. So you will certify that for your projects that have a total project cost, right, not just your award cost, equaling 5 million or more, you may certify that all workers are paid at or above prevailing wage rates under federal law through the Davis-Bacon Act. Secondarily, you can provide a project labor agreement. Again, for same threshold here. You may certify that the project will either use unionized project workforce or includes a project labor agreement. If the certification is not provided, then the subrecipient must provide a project workforce continuity plan as well. And you can see the BEAD NOFO section there as well addressing that. Earlier I mentioned the cybersecurity and supply chain risk management requirements here. Prospective subrecipients must prepare a cybersecurity risk management plan and have that plan in place prior to the award of the grant. If the subrecipient is providing service to the area already, or the prospective subrecipient must demonstrate that it is ready to be operationalized upon providing service. If it is not yet providing service prior to the grant award or for new entrants, the plan must meet or must reflect the latest version of the NIST framework, and also be submitted to VT-BEAD prior to the allocation of funds. If the subrecipient makes any substantive changes to the plan, that new version should be submitted within 30 days. Along with this requirement is the cyber supply chain risk management plan, and this must be in place, again, prior to the award of the grant. If the subrecipient is providing service to the area already, or the prospective subrecipient must demonstrate that it is ready to be operationalized upon providing service. They must meet a few requirements, so be based on key practices discussed in an ISTIR, cybersecurity chain management observations from the industry, be based on related SCRM guidance from NIST, and specify the controls to be implemented. I mentioned earlier the harmonization with Treasury's uniform guidance updates here. VT-BEAD plans to utilize the fixed subaward structure as their payment structure for the BEAD program to reduce the program's administrative costs and promote participation in the BEAD program. VT-BEAD may award subawards on a cost reimbursement basis if specific cases warrant this type of agreement. So subrecipients under the fixed subaward payment method are not required to comply with the cost principles under uniform guidance pursuant to NTIA's updates. So the utilization of the fixed subaward repayment structure allows VT-BEAD to provide some flexibility for the ISPs or providers that are under the BEAD program. And so some of the applicability under uniform guidance is then waived if they're utilizing the fixed subawards. The following will be required of subrecipients before any disbursement of BEAD funds can be made. So they will have a specific project milestone payment structure where the VT-BEAD will require reporting of the completed milestones of the project. And then part of this will be the monitoring of those milestones as well. VT-BEAD will monitor the activities for common fraud activities, including false claims for materials and labor, bribes, product substitution, etc. I mentioned earlier as well that monitoring compliance does have a very prescriptive outline for the BEAD program. Throughout the BEAD program, NTIA is conducting ongoing monitoring for the eligible entities of the states. Progress against its original initial proposal volume 1 and 2, and will ensure that the requirements of the Infrastructure Act are met. So the expectations really that trickle down to the subrecipients, they can expect a thorough and structured monitoring program aimed at ensuring the compliance with all the policies and procedures under the BEAD program. This will include, but is not limited to regular reviews of financial and programmatic performance. And some of those methods that we use are on-site visits, desk reviews, self-assessments, maybe additional reporting as well. Subrecipients should be prepared to provide comprehensive and accurate documentation. So one of the things we say on our side too is document, 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 including financial records, expenditure reports, proof of compliance with program guidelines. And you may need to share internal policies and procedures demonstrating internal controls that relate back to 2 CFR 200 or the uniform guidance that is applicable still under the fixed subaward structure, and may have to participate in discussions with monitoring staff to clarify practices and address any potential compliance issues. Just to highlight here, all records and expenditures will be subject to that monitoring and compliance that I outlined in the previous slide. So I just wanted to highlight that briefly to ensure that subrecipients have a clear expectation of what is required under the monitoring and compliance structure. So BEAD compliance and reporting, again, is a little different than some of the programs that you may be used to, including the framework for the frequency of the reporting. BEAD does have a semi-annual reporting requirement, including a minimum of the following, which includes speed, pricing and fees, interconnection agreements. There is updated guidance that is pre-decisional at the time of this webinar that does outline more of the reporting requirements, as well as the site visit requirements and things like that we weave into the program compliance and reporting framework, as well as reporting for the labor that I mentioned earlier under Davis-Bacon. So again, the certification or the project labor reports. And just to highlight again, the BEAD compliance requirements, Build America, NEPA, NHPA, are really some of the bigger ones that we haven't seen in prior programs that, again, are either were a preference in other programs that are now mandated or that are just newly mandated in these programs. So again, I know that is a lot of information in a very short amount of time, especially in an overview, but as Jill mentioned, we will be providing additional breakouts on training, and you may need, extra time on NHPA and NEPA to really understand the breadth of the requirement. But at this time, I do want to open it up to some questions to see if you have any on anything we've covered today.